The ledger in my hands felt heavier than a broadsword. I flipped through the frozen parchment, a chilling realization settling over me. All around me, my newly assembled crew stood in silence in the dim light of the icy cavern. They couldn't and Appos, read, but their eyes were glued to the little black book. I quickly stashed it inside my heavy long coat and signaled Alara to drag the captured smuggler captain away for interrogation. We needed to know exactly how these supply lines were operating. Moments later, muffled screams echoed through the frost-peaked caverns. Valerius, my newly appointed guard captain, led me deeper into the hidden subterranean depot. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. Crates of high-grade Imperial Arcanium armor, herds of sturdy warmounts, and mountains of provisions filled the massive space. I drew my dagger, slicing open a heavy burlap sack. Pure, man-infused winter wheat poured out, shimmering faintly in the gloom. Valerius scooped up a handful, his face twisting with absolute fury. End quote. This is pristine, end quote, he growled. End quote. The kind of rations the common folk never even see. End quote. End quote. Exactly, end quote, I replied, voicing the dark suspicion that had been gnawing at me. End quote. This is disaster relief from the capital and Appos' royal vaults. That armor bears the crest of the Holy Solarian military. A high-ranking cardinal or noble diverted these straight from the national reserves. End quote. The dates in the ledger matched perfectly. The shipments had arrived 2 months ago, right when the northern Vanguard Army deployed to the Obsidian Fortress. The conspiracy was obvious. Smuggle the supplies to the northern frustrators, cut off the Vanguard's supply lines, and starve them into a crushing defeat. If the Vanguard fell, the Obsidian Fortress would shatter, leaving the entire kingdom defenseless. Valerius was ready to mount up immediately. He wanted to ride straight to the fortress and present the evidence to the Vanguard's legendary female commander. I shut that idea down instantly. End quote. Who would believe a disgraced noble and a band of scavengers? End quote. I asked coldly. End quote. With the ledger as proof, they'll just claim it's a forgery. Whoever has the power to orchestrate this definitely has spies embedded in the military. You and Appos, be assassinated with a poison bolt before you even reach the commander and Appos' tent. End quote. I ordered him to silence our men. The existence of the ledger was now a classified secret. Anyone who opened their mouth would be executed. Quietly. No public declarations. The truth was, this was a high-level political bloodbath. Someone desperately wanted the Vanguard Army eradicated, even if it meant sacrificing millions of innocent civilians to the frustrators. While it disgusted me, I wasn't Appos, about to charge blindly into a meat grinder. The Vanguard was a massive force. Missing these specific supplies wouldn't and Appos, break them overnight. I'd be traveling to the fortress soon enough. I could figure out a safe way to establish contact then. Hauling our massive share of the spoils back to Ravenwood domain took 3 grueling days. Using captured war beasts and every able-bodied person Alara could muster, we dragged the fortune through the heavy snow. The Vane sisters, Arya and Lyra, had the most exhausting task, cataloging every single item. Arya handed me the finalized inventory scroll, 43 warmounts, herds of livestock, massive reserves of premium grain, and over 1,000 sets of Arcanium armor and weapons. I was thoroughly impressed, making sure to praise her meticulous work, cementing her role as my indispensable administrator. But the Imperial crests on the armor were a death sentence if discovered. I couldn't and Appos, arm my militia with them. Everything had to be melted down and reforged. Thankfully, Brock's new Runic forge was almost operational, so the reforging could start immediately. Winter soon arrived, sinking its freezing teeth into Ravenwood. Silas, the traveling merchant, returned from the southern trade routes with a massive haul of beast feed and something far more valuable. He dropped 3 heavy sacks at my feet. End quote. Ether dust, end quote. I grinned, inspecting the volatile, shimmering powder. High quality and dirt cheap. With this, I had enough materials to manufacture serious quantities of explosive runic charges through the entire winter. Silas tried to fish for information, wondering what I needed it for. I just smirked, gave him a cryptic answer about alchemical medicine, and let him guess. Our peaceful morning shattered when Alara sprinted into the courtyard. Valerius was right behind her, stumbling, soaked in his own blood, and nursing 3 deep crossbow bolts in his back. The allied mercenary faction had imploded. The second in command, a treacherous snake named Kaelen, had allied with a rival guild called the Bloodfang Syndicate. They had orchestrated a massive ambush to assassinate Lucian, their leader. Valerius coughed up blood, gripping my coat. End quote. Lucian is trapped in the vault. Kaelen knows where it is, they have limited supplies. End quote. He collapsed, unconscious. Alara drew her blades. End quote. Do we intervene, my lord? End quote. Silas stepped forward, panicking. End quote. Are you insane? Interfere in a guild war? We should just treat Valerius and wash our hands of this. End quote. End quote. Shut up, Silas. End quote. I snapped. I looked down at Valerius. A man willing to die for his leader was a rare commodity in this broken world. And Valerius had promised me that if I saved Lucian today, their entire faction would swear fealty to me. That alone was worth the bloodshed. End quote. Alara, end quote. I commanded. End quote. Saddle the fastest mounts. We ride immediately. End quote. I tossed her a heavy, frost-forged cleaver from our captured armory. Silas grabbed a broadsword and ordered his veteran escorts to assemble. He cursed his own stupidity, but he refused to let me die alone. We rode out with terrifying speed. Just me, Alara, Silas, and 4 hardened escorts. I kept a close eye on Alara. This rescue was a test of her loyalty. Truthfully, I didn't care much for Lucian, the effeminate scholar leader. I wanted his giant bodyguard, a behemoth who would make the perfect vanguard. No matter how I calculated this, the risk was highly profitable. We reached the frozen base of the mountain and climbed the steep path on foot. The Bloodfang stronghold was a complete slaughterhouse. Dozens of bodies littered the snow. Spotting movement near the main hall, I silently signaled the team to breach a ruined side building. Inside, we found a terrified young woman hiding beneath the floorboards. Her name was Seraphina. She recognized my name instantly. Valerius had called me a hero. She frantically explained that Lucian was hiding in a secret vault. The entrance was under a massive gargoyle statue in the main hall. I told her to stay hidden. We crept toward the main hall, staying low beneath the frosted windows. I split the team. Alara took the right flank, Silas took the left. I walked straight through the heavy front doors alone, drawing all their attention to set up a brutal 3-sided ambush. I pushed open the doors and found myself face to face with Kaelen. He stared at me, frozen in shock. In those brief seconds, my eyes scanned the hall. 10 enemies in total. They outnumbered us, but in raw fighting ability, we completely outclassed them. My throwing dagger flew first, severing Kaelen and Apo's hand at the wrist. He screamed. 2 archers tried to rush him, but I was already moving. My heavy cleaver cut a fatal arc across Kael's chest. Right on cue, Silas and Alara shattered the windows, crashing into the enemy flanks. I dealt with my side in seconds. 2 archers dropped with single strikes. I stepped inside a mercenary and Apo's guard, shattered his elbow, and drove my blade deep into his ribs. The last archer saw his comrades butchered, and his legs gave out. He screamed and tried to run. I calmly threw my second dagger. It buried itself strictly in the back of his neck. 6 kills in mere moments. I walked over to Kaelen, who was bleeding out against a marble pillar. End quote. Your mistake was fighting instead of running. End quote. I whispered coldly. End quote. I despise traitors. End quote. He twitched and died. I wiped my blade and looked up. The others had finished their skirmishes too. There was no time to waste. The real prize was still locked underneath that gargoyle, and I was going to collect. I examined the heavy stone tiles around the gargoyle's base. A hollow draft kissed my ankles, confirming a subterranean. End quote. Stand down. We and Appos. Re from Ravenwood. End quote. Alara barked, her own dual blades instantly raised. A hulking figure stepped out of the gloom. Thorn. The giant bodyguard was a mountain of muscle and scar tissue, wielding a sword as tall as a normal man. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by a heavy sigh of relief. He lowered the blade and pushed open the heavy iron door behind him. Inside the cramped, freezing chamber lay Lucian. The scholar leader was pale as snow, a nasty gash across his shoulder hastily bandaged with torn silk. Two of Thorn's most loyal men stood over him with drawn steel. Lucian looked up at me, a bitter, self-deprecating smile on his face. End quote. Lord Kaelen? How utterly humiliating for you to see me like this. End quote. His wound was bloody but wooden and Appos, to kill him. End quote. Save your breath. End quote. I told him, already formulating the extraction. End quote. Your surviving men will take the main tunnel out. Thorn and I will take the back exit and deal with Malachar and Appos' forces at the rock quarry. End quote. Lucian immediately protested. End quote. Malachar has merged with the Bloodfang Syndicate. He has at least 20 hardened killers waiting out there. We need to fall back into the deep caverns and wait them out. End quote. End quote. No, end quote. I replied, my voice leaving no room for argument. End quote. If we run, Malachar will eventually trace this rescue back to Ravenwood. That ambitious rat is a loose end, and I Don and Appos, to leave loose ends breathing. End quote. Thorn nodded in agreement, his bloodlust evident. We triggered the rear exit mechanism. The disguised rock wall ground open, spilling blinding winter light into the tunnel. Outside, Malachar was pacing, a cruel grin on his scarred face, fully expecting Lucian's exhausted, starving remnants to stumble out. Then, his eyes locked onto me. The color instantly drained from his face. Panic, realization, and sheer terror hit him simultaneously. He knew exactly what had happened in the main hall. Without a word of bravado, he turned and sprinted for the treeline. Smarter than Kael, I thought, but it wouldn't and Appos, to save him. I unslung my heavy ether crossbow from my back. End quote. Alara, cover my flank. End quote. She drew her blades and planted herself beside me. Thorn roared like a feral beast, charging straight into the Bloodfang mercenaries, while Silas led our escorts into the fray. The clash of steel and the hiss of runic magic filled the freezing air. Blood sprayed across the white snow. I ignored the melee, tracking Malachar through my heavy iron sights. The old fox knew the devastating power of an ether weapon and kept zigzagging erratically behind the jagged ice formations. With a modern sniper rifle from my past life, his head would already be a red mist. But an ether bolt took a crucial second to charge its kinetic runes. I had to predict his movement. I noticed a white, armored frost strider tied to a dead pine ahead of him. His escape ticket. I lowered the crossbow just a fraction and waited. Let him think he'd outsmarted me. Meanwhile, Alara was struggling. 3 massive Bloodfang brutes had her pinned down, their heavy axes forcing her to give ground, inch by inch. She was barely parrying their blows. End quote. Hold them. End quote. I commanded coldly, keeping my eye on the sight. She gritted her teeth, unleashing a flurry of desperate strikes, fighting like a woman with absolutely nothing to lose. Malachar reached the mount. Just as I predicted, he lunged forward to grab the reins. I squeezed the trigger. The runic coil snapped with the sound of a thunderclap. The glowing bolt punched cleanly through his shoulder, the sheer kinetic force lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the snow. End quote. Did you really think I would and Appos, to account for the beast? End quote. I muttered, dropping the spent crossbow and drawing my cleaver. A gap opened in Alara's defense. 2 mercenaries rushed her from both sides. Shikuden and Appos, dodged without exposing my back, so she stood her ground. A jagged blade sliced deep into her leather armor, drawing a spray of blood across her chest. She screamed but immediately drove her knee into her attacker, and Appos' groin. Before her foot even hit the snow, I was there. My cleaver buried itself into the neck of the man who cut her. End quote. You did well, end quote, I told her, stepping in front of her. Then I waded into the slaughter. No flashy swordplay, no honorable dueling. Just the brutal, hyper-efficient killing arts of a modern mercenary applied to cold steel. I severed tendons, crushed windpipes, and bled them out in seconds. The sheer ruthlessness of it broke their morale. Within moments, the remaining mercenaries scattered. I left the cleanup to Silas and Thorn, sprinting toward where Malachar had fallen. The old traitor had dragged himself behind a boulder. Following the bloody trail, my combat instincts flared. I sidestepped just as Malachar swung a hidden dagger from the shadows. I caught his wrist, twisted it until the bone snapped, and delivered a devastating kick to his jaw. He crashed against the rock, his body utterly broken. Before he could attempt to stand, my blade was resting against his throat. End quote. Your rebellion actually saved me some time, end quote, I told him, watching the fear in his eyes. End quote. If you hadn't betrayed Lucian, I would have had to manufacture an excuse to kill you myself. End quote. He coughed up dark blood, laughing bitterly. End quote. I lost. Do it, end quote. I raised the cleaver. End quote. Wait, end quote. He choked out, desperation finally breaking him. End quote. I know a secret. A secret about Lucian. Sparing him will bring the wrath of the Solarian Empire down on Ravenwood. Let me go, and I'll tell you. End quote. End quote. Speak, end quote, I said. He swallowed hard. End quote. Lucian isn and some bandit king. No ordinary outlaw builds runic vaults or studies imperial battle tactics. There is a locked chest in his quarters, it holds the crest of the moon blood. End quote. I let him talk, draining every piece of useful information from him. He told me of underground rebel factions, of ancient bloodlines, of impending civil war. When he finally ran out of breath, he looked at me expectantly, then pulled himself up, limping toward the Frost Strider. He thought we had a deal. I drove my cleaver straight into the center of his back. The heavy steel severed his spine with a sickening crunch. He collapsed, blood bubbling from his lips, staring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. End quote. You broke your word, end quote, he gurgled. I walked over, placing my boot on his shoulder, and ripped the blade out. End quote. I never made you a promise. Letting you speak your last words was the only mercy you were ever going to get. End quote. I brought the blade down, finishing it. 2 days later, the scent of antiseptic herbs filled the Ravenwood infirmary. Elara's chest wound was stitched, and she was recovering well. The armor had taken the brunt of the blow, and her loyalty was now unquestionable. Lucian was resting in the guest manor, heavily guarded by Thorn. But my focus was on Valerius. The loyal guard captain had survived his crossbow wounds, though he was still pale and bedridden. I walked into his quarters, locked the heavy oak door, and poured him a cup of hot spiced wine. End quote. You promised me your absolute loyalty, through fire and death, if I saved your master, end quote, I said, pulling up a chair. Valerius met my gaze, his eyes burning with conviction. End quote. I did. And I am a knight of my word. My life is yours, Lord Kaelen, end quote. End quote. Good. Because you're going to tell me exactly who I just risked my life for. Malachar mentioned the moon blood, end quote. Valerius went ashen. His hand trembled, nearly spilling the wine. He closed his eyes, realizing the secret was already out. If he lied now, it would mean breaking his oath to me. End quote. If you know of the moon blood, then you know the danger, end quote, Valerius whispered hoarsely. End quote. Do you know what ruled this continent before the Solarian Empire? End quote. End quote. The Lunar Kingdom, end quote, I replied, recalling the dusty history tomes I and read since arriving in this world. End quote. Conquered a century ago by the first Sun Emperor, end quote. End quote. Conquered, and then systemically erased, end quote, Valerius corrected, his voice dripping with ancient grief. And now, he was sitting right in my domain. I left Valerius to his rest, the weight of his confession settling over me. The crown prince of the fallen lunar kingdom was sleeping under my roof. The political ramifications were staggering. If I played this right, Lucian's bloodline was the key to legitimizing my eventual conquest of the north. But before I could conquer anything, I needed to ensure my own domain was absolutely impenetrable. As I stepped into the frozen courtyard, a sharp voice cut through the howling wind. End quote. Are you completely out of your mind? End quote. I turned to see Vesper storming toward me. She was the daughter of the disgraced Earl of Winterreach, and my politically arranged fiancé. A fierce, blade-wielding noblewoman who had been stewing in anger for days while I was out hunting mercenaries. End quote. You rode out with 5 people, end quote, she hissed, closing the distance. End quote. Against a fortified syndicate stronghold. Do you have a death wish, Kaelen? End quote. Vesper was highly skilled with a rapier, trained by Imperial duelists, but her sheltered upbringing blinded her to the ugly realities of warfare. She accused me of being reckless, mumbling tearfully that if I died, her family and Apo's last chance at reclaiming their honor died with me. I called her into the armory. The moment the heavy iron doors slammed shut, she looked nervous. End quote. You think you understand combat, Vesper? End quote. I asked, my voice dangerously calm. End quote. Assess your skills. Honestly. End quote. She lifted her chin. End quote. I can handle 3, maybe 4 standard foot soldiers. End quote. End quote. Good. End quote. I nodded. End quote. But do you understand the gap between dueling and slaughter? End quote. I didn't end Apo's draw a weapon. I simply let my killing intent surface. It was the raw, suffocating aura of a man who had spent a previous lifetime wiping out targets in Black Ops warfare. The temperature in the armory seemed to drop 10 degrees. The warmth vanished from my eyes, replaced by the dead, calculating stare of a predator. Vesper stumbled backward. She looked at me as if a demon had crawled out of my skin. Her hands shook too badly to draw her blade. End quote. Strike me, end quote, I ordered. Pride forced her to lunge. Her rapier was a silver blur aiming for my shoulder. I didn't end Apo's parry. I stepped into the strike, letting the blade graze my heavy coat. With my left hand I caught her wrist, paralyzing the nerve with a sharp strike. With my right I swept her legs. She hit the stone floor hard. Before she could blink, my boot was on her forearm, and my hunting knife was pressed gently against her throat. End quote. Forms can be taught, end quote, I whispered, pulling the blade back and offering her a hand up. End quote. Survival cannot. I am a weapon, Vesper. Understand that before you question my calculated risks again, end quote. She took my hand, flushed with a mix of humiliation and awe. The lesson landed perfectly. She finally understood she was and Apo's dealing with a normal noble. Leaving her to process the encounter, I headed straight for the industrial sector. The Runic forge was finally operational. The massive ether furnace roared, casting a brilliant blue glow across the soot-stained walls. Brock, my master runic smith, looked like a madman possessed. Bare-chested despite the freezing draft, his muscular frame was slick with sweat. He had already begun melting down the captured Imperial Arcanium, stripping away the Solarian crests to reforge them into blank plates. End quote. Forget standard swords, end quote, I told him, tossing a heavy scroll onto his anvil. End quote. Priority is 100 runic spearheads for the militia. After that, agricultural tools. The salvaged iron is low grade anyway, end quote. Brock looked insulted. End quote. You want me to forge plows? I am a master of the ether arts, end quote. End quote. The simple stuff is for your apprentices, end quote. I smirked, pulling a second schematic from my coat. End quote. Your real assignment is this, end quote. I unrolled the blueprint for the Aegis-class Arcanium armor. It was a masterpiece of interlocking, dragon-scale design, infused with kinetic runes that absorbed impact and redistributed the force. It was virtually impervious to standard piercing and slashing. Brock's eyes went wide. He traced the complex runic circuitry, then noticed the other sketches peeking out of my coat designs for matchlock ether rifles and heavy runic artillery. End quote. Are those? End quote. He stammered, pointing a thick finger. End quote. Prove you can forge the Aegis armor first. End quote. I said coldly. End quote. If you can end oppose, handle this, you aren't end oppose, ready for the firearms. End quote. For a craftsman obsessed with pushing his limits, there was no better bait. He swore he would forge the armor perfectly. I needed that suit. When the time came to confront the Solarian Empire, I needed a personal lifeline that could withstand a holy siege. With industrial preparations underway, I made my way to the guest manor. It was time to test Lucian. He was a ticking bomb. If I could control him, his bloodline would be invaluable. If he tried to use me as a pawn for his royal ambitions, I'd execute him myself. I found him sitting by the hearth, studying a map of the Northern Territories. Thorn stood silently in the corner. End quote. Do you know why Malika rebelled? End quote. I asked, sitting across from him. Lucian sighed, rubbing his bandaged shoulder. End quote. Greed. When the Imperial supplies were hijacked, he saw a chance to arm his men and take over. End quote. He didn't end oppose, mention his lunar bloodline at all. I mentally filed that omission away. End quote. What do you want now, Lucian? End quote. End quote. To serve as your chief strategist. End quote. He replied smoothly. End quote. You have the ambition. I have the tactical education. End quote. End quote. All right. Analyze the Vanguard Army and oppose, as situation. End quote. Lucian leaned over the map. End quote. The Frost Beast hordes are camped just 50 miles from the Obsidian Fortress. Yet, the Central Solarian Army's haven and oppose, marched north to reinforce them. It's a deliberate trap. A faction within the Holy Church wants the Vanguard decimated to weaken the Emperor and oppose, as authority. End quote. He was sharp. He deduced the conspiracy I had already proven with the ledger. But more importantly, letting the Vanguard die would serve a lunar restoration perfectly, allowing the Empire to crumble from within. End quote. So, end quote, I probed. End quote. What should we do? End quote. End quote. We protect the Vanguard. End quote. Lucian said firmly. End quote. If the fortress falls, the beasts will slaughter the northern civilians. No crown is worth an empire of ash. End quote. I nodded, satisfied for now. End quote. How does a small lord like me influence a war? End quote. Lucian smiled, tapping a location on the map. End quote. We annihilate the remaining Blood-Fang Syndicate. They control the Frost Strider breeding grounds. If we seize those mounts, we build heavy cavalry. We supply the Vanguard, earn their favor, and absorb the surrounding outlaw territories. End quote. 3 birds with 1 stone. It was a ruthless, brilliant strategy that aligned perfectly with my own plans. End quote. Rest up, Lucian. End quote. I said, standing up. End quote. The north is about to bleed. End quote. The freezing winds of Ravenwood carried a new sound the morning after my conversation with Lucian, the heavy crunch of hundreds of boots marching through the deep snow. Vane, my chief administrator, woke me before dawn with urgent news. A massive caravan of refugees and defectors from a neighboring settlement, Ashwood, had arrived at our iron gates. They had seen the spoils we dragged back from the Blood-Fang Syndicate and realized that while the rest of the Northern Territories starved, Ravenwood was feasting. In this brutal era, survival dictated loyalty. They stood shivering in the courtyard, holding whatever meager property deeds, rusted tools, and heirlooms they possessed, begging to be absorbed into my rapidly expanding domain. I walked out onto the high stone balcony, wrapping my heavy wool fur coat tight against the biting chill. The crowd below fell dead silent, looking up at me with desperate, hollow eyes. I didn't end oppose, offer them warm platitudes or false promises of an easy, peaceful life. I offered them a cold, hard contract. End quote. Ravenwood is. Several women from the original refugee group were hard at work, their hands moving with practiced efficiency under the harsh glow of ether lamps. They were disassembling the crude blood-fawn leather armor we had captured and reassembling it into a sleek, overlapping design I had drafted the night before. By weaving thin threads of conductive ether wire through hardened beast hide, the armor became lightweight, highly flexible, and capable of deflecting standard sword strikes without hindering mobility. Elara was currently overseeing the security detail in the courtyard, her arms still bound in fresh bandages from the deep cut she took protecting my flank during the raid. I called her into the workshop. When she saw the prototype suit resting on the wooden mannequin, her eyes widened. It was a masterpiece of lethal pragmatism, dark, form-fitting, and reinforced at all major joints with tempered steel. End quote. This is yours, end quote, I told her, tossing her the heavy chest piece. She caught it, looking completely stunned. End quote, my lord? Armor of this grade, even the Vanguard's elite scouts Dan and Appos, have access to ether-stitched gear. It's far too valuable for a mere mercenary captain. End quote. End quote. You took a blade meant for me, end quote, I replied coldly, though not without a layer of genuine respect. End quote. I Dan and Appos, leave debts unpaid, and I Dan and Appos, let my best commanders march into battle wearing rags. Put it on. That's an order, end quote. When she emerged fully suited, the overlapping leather plates shifted silently with her movements. She looked terrifying, practically radiating lethal intent. She dropped to one knee, swearing her undying loyalty, her previous mercenary pragmatism fully replaced by absolute, unquestioning devotion. While Elara tested her new gear, I had one more piece of psychological leverage to secure. Brock, my master runic smith, was an undeniable genius, but a genius needed a tether, a deeply personal reason to fight for me beyond mere professional pride. I remembered Seraphina, the terrified young woman we had rescued from the Bloodfawn vault. She had mentioned growing up in the southern artisan districts, the exact same place Brock had apprenticed before the Solarian purges burned it to the ground. I walked over to the Runic forge, grabbing Brock by the shoulder just as he was preparing to hammer a glowing slab of Arcanium. End quote. Put the hammer down, Brock. Come with me, end quote, I ordered. He grumbled about breaking his rhythm, wiping sweat and black soot from his brow, but he followed me across the snowy courtyard to the guest manor. I led him down the quiet corridor and pushed open the heavy oak door to the infirmary wing. Seraphina was standing by the frosted window, quietly folding linen bandages. At the sound of the door creaking, she turned. Brock froze in his tracks. The massive, muscular blacksmith, a man who could bend cold iron with his bare hands, suddenly looked like a terrified, fragile child. He dropped his heavy leather gloves to the floor. End quote. Sarah? End quote. His voice cracked. The ceramic bowl in Seraphina's hands shattered against the stone floor. She didn't end Appos, say a word. She just sprinted across the room and threw herself into his massive arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Brock buried his face in her hair, heavy tears cutting clean tracks through the thick soot on his cheeks. They had been separated for years, each firmly believing the other had been slaughtered by the Solarian Inquisitors. I quietly stepped backward and pulled the doors shut, giving them their privacy. Lucian was leaning against the wall in the hallway, an amused, knowing smile on his pale, aristocratic face. End quote. You are a terrifyingly calculating man, Kaelen, end quote, Lucian murmured, crossing his arms. End quote. You just bought that blacksmith and Appos' eternal soul for the price of a simple introduction, end quote. End quote. I just reunited two lost lovers, Lucian, end quote, I replied dryly, walking past him. End quote. Dan and Appos, make me sound like a monster, end quote. End quote. The best monsters, end quote, he chuckled, following my pace, end quote, are the ones who know exactly how to play the hero, end quote. 3 days later, we held a massive winter feast in the grand hall of Ravenwood to celebrate Brock and Seraphina's sudden wedding. I provided generous amounts of roasted beast meat, spiced wine, and freshly baked bread for the entire domain. The new migrants from Ashwood watched in absolute awe. In a world slowly freezing to death under the heel of a corrupt empire, we were drinking and laughing like kings. Brock's gratitude bordered on religious zealotry. After his wedding night, he returned to the Runic forge like a man possessed by ancient spirits. The rhythmic pounding of his heavy hammer echoed through the valley day and night. He was channeling every ounce of his love, his profound gratitude, and his genius into forging my Aegis-class Arcanium armor. I stood on the balcony overlooking the celebrations, swirling a cup of dark wine. My forces were growing. My command structure was fiercely loyal to the death. My industry was rapidly outpacing anything in the Northern Territories. But as I stared out into the endless, dark blizzard howling beyond the mountains, I knew the real test was fast approaching. The Vanguard Army was bleeding out in the snow, and the Solarian Empire's inquisitors would soon come looking for their stolen supplies. I needed to be ready for war. The biting wind howled through the jagged peaks of Ravenwood, carrying a relentless blizzard that threatened to bury the entire domain. Inside the courtyard, however, the cold was met with the burning intensity of industry and preparation. The time for hiding behind our fortified stone walls had officially passed. If we were going to survive the encroaching winter and the political bloodbath of the Solarian Empire, Ravenwood needed teeth. I stood on the raised training platform, watching Alara drill the newly formed militia. Thanks to the influx of Ashwood refugees, our numbers had swelled. I had personally selected 60 of the most able-bodied men and women, stripping them of their farming tools and replacing them with Brock's freshly forged weaponry. The runic spearheads glinted with a faint, lethal blue luminescence in the dim morning light. These Warren and Appos, T-standard iron pikes. They were ether-conductive weapons capable of piercing standard Imperial armor like wet parchment. Alara was in her element. Clad in her prototype ether-stitched leather armor, she moved like a shadow, effortlessly disarming 2 recruits at once before barking corrections. Her mercenary past made her a brutal but highly effective instructor. Lucian stood beside me on the platform, bundled in heavy furs, watching the synchronized thrusts of the spear line. End quote. They learn fast, end quote, he murmured, his breath pluming in the freezing air. End quote. But a militia is still just a militia. Against the blood-fang syndicate and Appos, hardened killers, discipline will shatter once the blood starts spraying. End quote. End quote. Which is why we aren't and Appos, going to fight a traditional battle, end quote, I replied smoothly. I turned to Valerius, who was finally out of the infirmary, though he still leaned heavily on a cane. End quote. Are the extraction teams ready? End quote. Valerius nodded firmly. End quote. Silas has the cargo sleds prepared. If we secure the breeding grounds, we can transport the entire herd of Froststriders back to Ravenwood before nightfall. But my lord, assaulting a fortified valley with green recruits is an immense risk. End quote. End quote. It's a calculated one. End quote. I corrected him. I pulled a heavy canvas satchel from the table behind me. Inside rested 6 spherical iron canisters, densely packed with the volatile ether dust Silas had procured weeks ago. I had spent the last 3 nights modifying them with pressure fuses. End quote. The recruits are in and Appos, there to breach the walls. They are the anvil. I am the hammer. End quote. 2 hours later, our strike force marched out into the blinding white maelstrom. The objective was a secluded valley 20 miles north, the primary breeding grounds for the Bloodfang Syndicate's Froststriders. Whoever controlled the heavy, armored mounts controlled the speed of the Northern Territories. The trek was brutal. The snow was knee-deep, and the temperature was cold enough to crack bone. I rode at the vanguard on a captured mount, scanning the shifting treeline with a military spyglass. Beside me, Alara kept her dual blades loose in their sheaths, her eyes darting through the blizzard. Lucian had insisted on accompanying us, claiming a chief strategist needed to see his lord and Appos' battlefield tactics firsthand. By midday, we reached the ridge overlooking the valley. The Bloodfang outpost was heavily fortified, built into a natural ravine. Thick wooden palisades reinforced with iron spikes blocked the only entrance. Behind the walls, I could see, even with runic spears, your militia will be slaughtered in the bottleneck. End quote. End quote. Watch closely, your highness. End quote. I whispered mockingly. End quote. You're about to see how wars are fought in my world. End quote. I signaled Ilara. She deployed the militia into a wide crescent formation just outside the crossbows and oppos, effective range, ordering them to lock their shields and present a solid wall of runic spears. Then I dismounted, grabbing the heavy satchel of ether charges. I didn't end oppos, take an escort. I moved alone, blending into the heavy snowfall, utilizing the stealth techniques ingrained in my muscle memory from a past life. I slipped from rock to rock, a phantom in the blizzard, bypassing their forward sentries with silent, lethal knife strikes to the throat. I reached the base of the massive wooden gates completely undetected. I quickly planted 3 of the iron canisters against the main load-bearing hinges, setting the crude friction fuses. I sprinted back toward the tree-line just as a mercenary on the catwalk spotted my tracks in the snow. He opened his mouth to shout an alarm. He was cut off by a deafening, earth-shattering roar. The ether dust detonated with catastrophic kinetic force. The explosion ripped through the frozen air, creating a shockwave that threw the mercenaries off the catwalks. The massive iron-reinforced gates didn't end oppos, just break. They were vaporized into thousands of lethal wooden splinters. Blue runic fire washed over the entrance, leaving a gaping, smoking crater where the impenetrable defense had stood seconds before. Before the smoke could even clear, I drew my cleaver and roared the command. End quote. Push! End quote. The Ravenwood militia surged forward like a tidal wave. The psychological devastation of the explosion had completely broken the blood-fang syndicate and oppos. Morale. Mercenaries stumbled blindly through the smoke, their eardrums shattered, only to be impaled by the advancing wall of runic spears. I waded into the chaos, my blade a blur of calculated violence. I severed limbs, crushed sternums, and dismantled their chain of command with terrifying efficiency. Ilara was a whirlwind of leather and steel beside me, taking down anyone who managed to slip past my guard. The battle was over in less than 10 minutes. It was an oppos fight. It was a systematic execution. We had secured the valley. Silas immediately brought the sleds down to begin wrangling the massive herd of frost striders. Lucian walked through the smoking ruins of the gates, looking at me with a mixture of profound awe and deep-seated terror. He had never seen explosive engineering combined with such ruthless tactical precision. But the victory celebration was cut short. Valerius hobbled out of the main command tent, his face pale. End quote. Lord Kaelen, end quote, Valerius called out, his voice tight with anxiety. End quote. You need to see this. End quote. I wiped the blood from my face and followed him inside. Bound to a wooden chair in the center of the room was a man wearing the battered, soot-stained robes of the Holy Solarian Church. His face was bruised, clearly having been interrogated by the blood-fang mercenaries before our assault. But it was the intricate, golden sunburst tattoo on his neck that made my blood run cold. An Imperial Inquisitor. The man looked up, spitting blood onto the dirt floor. He stared at me, his eyes burning with fanatic zeal. End quote. You are an oppos syndicate, end quote, he rasped, noting my clean, disciplined forces. End quote. But you carry the stench of stolen Arcanium, end quote. The Solarian Empire was and oppos just looking for their missing supplies. They were already here. The man bound to the wooden chair spat a thick glob of blood onto the frozen dirt floor. Despite his battered state, the golden sunburst tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse with an arrogant, residual warmth. An Imperial Inquisitor of the Holy Solarian Church. To the common folk of this world, these men were walking demigods, judge and executioner rolled into one terrifying package. To me, he was just another hostile asset holding information I needed. Valerius stood by the tent flap, his hand resting uneasily on his sword hilt. As a former Imperial Knight, the ingrained reverence for the Church was hard to shake. Lucian, however, remained completely hidden in the darkest corner of the tent, his breathing shallow. He knew exactly what the Inquisition did to those bearing lunar blood. End quote. You are making a terminal mistake, warlord. End quote. The Inquisitor rasped, his voice dripping with venomous fanaticism. End quote. The stolen Arcanium in your possession is a sin against the Sun Emperor. The Purge Brigades are already marching north. You will burn, your fortress will burn, and your people will be flayed alive. End quote. I pulled up a wooden stool and sat directly in front of him, my expression blank. End quote. You were captured by a third-rate mercenary syndicate, Inquisitor. Your Purge Brigades didn't and oppose. Seem in a rush to save you. End quote. End quote. I let them capture me. End quote. He sneered, a fanatical light dancing in his eyes. End quote. The Bloodfang Syndicate was a necessary tool. We needed them to funnel the stolen supplies to the frustrators, to ensure the Vanguard Army starves. The North must be cleansed by the ice before the Church can reclaim it. It is the Emperor and Oppos, as divine will. End quote. Valerius stepped forward, his face pale with horror. End quote. You deliberately cut off the Vanguard? You are letting the Obsidian Fortress fall? Millions of innocent Solarian citizens will be slaughtered by the beasts. End quote. The Inquisitor laughed, a dry, rattling sound. End quote. There are no innocents in the North. Only heretics and the remnants of a dead kingdom. The Vanguard commander grew too popular, too independent. She had to be broken. End quote. I leaned forward, pulling a small, glass vial of volatile ether dust from my coat. I uncorked it, letting the shimmering blue powder catch the dim light. End quote. Fascinating geopolitics. End quote. I murmured. End quote. But you didn't end oppose. Let yourself get captured just to play courier for a bandit gang. A high-ranking Inquisitor doesn't end oppose. Travel without a specific target. Who are you hunting? End quote. The Inquisitor's eyes locked onto the vial, a flicker of genuine fear finally breaking his arrogant facade. He knew what ether dust did when ingested and ignited. End quote. The Sunhound Compass. End quote. The Inquisitor choked out, nodding toward a crushed silver device on the table nearby. End quote. It tracks ether anomalies, specifically, the tainted resonance of lunar royal blood. It pointed here. To this frozen wasteland. One of the Eclipse Brotherhood and Oppos, as figureheads, is hiding in the north. If I don and Oppos, report back, the Grand Cardinal will turn this entire mountain range into glass. End quote. In the corner of the tent, Lucian shifted, his silhouette rigid. The Inquisitor's head snapped toward the movement, his fanatic eyes narrowing as he stared into the shadows. End quote. Who is that? The resonance, it and Oppos, as strong. End quote. I didn't end Oppos, hesitate. Before the Inquisitor could utter another word or cast a runic distress signal, I drove my hunting knife cleanly upward through the bottom of his jaw, piercing straight into his brain. His eyes rolled back, and he slumped forward, dead instantly. Valerius let out a shaky breath, staring at the corpse. End quote. Lord Kaelen, you just assassinated a holy agent of the Solarian Church. End quote. End quote. I just silenced a scout. End quote. I corrected coldly, pulling my blade free and wiping it on the Inquisitor's robes. End quote. If he had recognized Lucian, the Empire wouldn't and Oppos, just send a Purge Brigade. They'd send a full crusade. We pack up immediately. Strip the outpost of anything valuable, burn the rest, and get those Frost Striders moving. We are officially on a ticking clock. End quote. The journey back to Ravenwood was a grueling, high-speed march against the escalating blizzard. Silas and Ilara expertly managed the captured herd. Over 100 heavily armored Frost Striders, massive, reptilian-mammalian hybrids bred for deep snow combat, trudged through the drifts. With these beasts, Ravenwood's militia was no longer a static defense force. We were a mechanized cavalry capable of devastating hit-and-run tactics. We reached the iron gates of Ravenwood just as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow. The Ashwood refugees and our citizens cheered as the massive herd was corralled into the newly built paddocks. It was a massive injection of military power. But I didn't end up. Veins of conductive ether wire pulsed faintly beneath the plating, connecting the heavy shoulder guards, the articulated gauntlets, and the reinforced chest piece. End quote. I did exactly as your blueprints demanded, Lord Kaelen. End quote. Brock breathed, wiping soot from his face. End quote. The kinetic dispersal runes are etched into the inner lining. If a broadsword strikes the chest, the kinetic force is instantly distributed across the entire suit and grounded through the boots. It's heavy, but the ambient ether magic makes it feel weightless once synchronized with the wearer. End quote. I stepped up to the armor, running my gloved hand over the freezing, indestructible metal. This was my insurance policy. In a world of magic, monsters, and fanatical empires, I finally had a shell that couldn't and oppose be easily broken. End quote. Help me equip it, end quote, I ordered. It took Brock and an apprentice 10 minutes to lock the various plates and leather straps into place. As the final chest clasp engaged, the ether runes flared to life, syncing with my body heat. The sheer power radiating from the suit was intoxicating. I rolled my shoulders, finding my mobility completely unimpeded. I drew my heavy cleaver, executing a rapid series of combat drills. The armor absorbed the momentum perfectly, anchoring my center of gravity. I was a walking fortress. I turned to Brock, deeply satisfied. End quote. You have secured your place in Ravenwood, Brock. Your craftsmanship is flawless. End quote. Before the blacksmith could offer his thanks, the heavy iron doors of the forge slammed open. Arya Vane stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, her face pale as a ghost. End quote. My lord, end quote, she gasped, clutching a frozen parchment. End quote. One of Silas's forward scouts just returned. He rode his mount to death to get here. End quote. I sheathed my cleaver, the heavy obsidian armor clanking softly. End quote. Report. End quote. End quote. It and Appos, as the Vanguard Army. End quote. Arya swallowed hard, her voice trembling. End quote. The obsidian fortress and Appos, as outer walls have been breached by the Frost Beast horde. They are falling back to the inner keep. But worse, a Solarian Purge-Brigade of 3,000 heavy infantry was spotted marching through the southern pass. End quote. I stared into the roaring fires of the Runic forge, my mind instantly calculating the brutal mathematics of our survival. The church was and Appos, waiting. They were coming to execute the vanguard, and they were coming to raze Ravenwood to the ground to cover their tracks. The two-front war had officially begun. The roaring fires of the Runic forge felt distinctly inadequate against the chilling silence that followed Arya's report. 3,000 heavy infantry. A Solarian Purge-Brigade was an executioner and Appos, S-Blade, a methodical, heavily armored force designed to burn entire cities to ash. And they were marching through the southern pass, heading straight for us and the crumbling obsidian fortress. Valerius gripped the pommel of his sword, his knuckles turning white. End quote. We have to ride out. If the vanguard falls to the beast horde, the fortress becomes a slaughterhouse. If the church reaches them first, they'll be burned as heretics. Either way, the north dies today. End quote. Lucian stepped out from the shadows of the forge, his aristocratic face tight with panic. End quote. 3,000 men, Kaelen. Even with the Frost Striders and the new Ether Spears, Ravenwood cannot withstand a siege of that magnitude. We must retreat deeper into the frozen wastes. End quote. End quote. Running just means dying tired. End quote. I replied, my voice completely devoid of panic. I turned to the massive tactical map etched into a leather hide hanging on the forge wall. My mind, trained in modern asymmetric warfare, immediately broke the insurmountable problem down into manageable, bloody equations. End quote. We split the forces. End quote. I commanded, tracing a line from Ravenwood to the obsidian fortress. End quote. Valerius, Ilara. You will take 80% of the militia and the entire herd of Frost Striders. Load the sleds with our surplus winter wheat. you are going to ride hard for the Vanguard. Break the beast siege from the rear, deliver the food, and offer them an alliance. The Vanguard commander needs supplies and cavalry. We have both." End quote. Elara frowned, the blue glow of the forge reflecting off her leather armor. End quote. "And leave Ravenwood undefended? What about the Purge-Brigade marching through the southern pass?" End quote. End quote. "They won and oppose to reach Ravenwood." End quote. I stated, tapping the narrow canyon on the map. End quote. "Because I am going to bury them in the pass." End quote. Lucian stared at me, aghast. End quote. "You? By yourself? That is 3,000 elite Imperial soldiers." End quote. End quote. "Not by myself." End quote. I corrected, looking over at my master smith. End quote. "Brock, empty the vault. Every single grain of aether dust, every scrap of unstable runic material we possess. Pack it into the heaviest iron casks you can forge in the next hour." End quote. Brock's eyes widened with manic realization, a vicious grin splitting his soot-stained face. End quote. "You want to bring the mountain down on them. Oh, my lord, the kinetic resonance will be glorious." End quote. End quote. "Lucian," end quote, I continued, turning to the lunar air. End quote. "You are going with the Vanguard relief force. As my chief strategist, your job is to negotiate the terms of our alliance with their commander." End quote. End quote. "You want me to negotiate with Imperial loyalists?" End quote. Lucian hissed, stepping closer. End quote. "I want you out of the vicinity of the Purge-Brigade." End quote. I whispered so only he could hear. End quote. "They have Sunhound compasses, Lucian. If they get within 5 miles of your royal blood, they will zero in on you. Go to the fortress. Prove your strategic worth. Or I will feed you to the wolves myself." End quote. Lucian swallowed hard, his eyes darting away. He nodded briskly and left to prepare his mount. Within the hour, the Ravenwood courtyard was a storm of organized chaos. Elara and Valerius mounted their massive, armored frost striders, leading a terrifying column of runic-armed cavalry. As the heavy iron gates swung open, they charged out into the blizzard, a thunderous wave of muscle and steel heading north to save the Vanguard. I headed south. My team was small, just myself, Silas, Brock, and 6 of my most trusted, stealth-trained scouts. We didn't oppose to ride beasts. We moved on foot, utilizing lightweight snowshoes and staying beneath the tree-line. The Aegis-class armor functioned perfectly. Despite its heavy obsidian plating, the ambient ether runes synchronized with my movements, making me feel like a phantom in the snow. We reached the southern pass just as the twilight began to bleed the color from the sky. It was a treacherous, narrow ravine flanked by towering cliffs of jagged ice and unstable shale. The perfect kill zone. End quote. "Rig the eastern wall." End quote. I ordered, gesturing to the massive overhang of compacted snow and rock above the trail. For 2 agonizing hours, hanging from frozen ropes, my team planted the heavy iron casks of ether dust deep into the natural fissures of the cliff face. Silas ran the conductive trigger wire down to a concealed overlook near the exit of the pass. We were freezing, our breath freezing to our masks, but the precision of the work kept us focused. Just as Brock connected the final kinetic detonator, the ground began to tremble. It was an earthquake. It was the synchronized marching of 3,000 iron-shod boots. I laid flat against the snowy ridge, peering through my military spyglass. Through the swirling white blizzard, a sea of golden banners emerged. The Sun Emperor's crest. Following the banners came the heavy infantry, hulking men clad in thick, sun-forged plate armor, carrying massive tower shields and halberds. In the center of the column rode a dozen inquisitors on armored war steeds, their golden robes violently contrasting with the bleak winter landscape. They marched with absolute arrogance, confident that no northern force could possibly challenge their holy might. They were bunched up, marching tight to conserve heat. A fatal tactical error. End quote, Brock, end quote, I whispered, keeping my eyes on the spyglass. End quote, hand me the detonator, end quote. The massive blacksmith passed me the heavy brass trigger mechanism. The conductive wire trailed off into the dark canyon walls above the Imperial Army. I waited. Patience is the deadliest weapon in a... The shockwave hit us a second later, a physical wall of force that nearly knocked Silas off his feet. Down in the pass, the Imperial soldiers didn't end oppose to even have time to scream. The explosion sheared 1,000,000 tons of ancient ice, jagged stone, and compacted snow from the mountain. It fell not like an avalanche, but like a localized extinction event. The massive tidal wave of debris crashed down into the narrow canyon with earth-shattering violence, burying the golden banners, the heavy infantry, and the Inquisitors under 50 feet of unbreakable winter rock. I looked down at the smoking, buried ravine. 3,000 men, erased in a single heartbeat. End quote. The pass is closed, end quote, I said coldly. The deafening silence that followed the avalanche was heavier than the explosion itself. I stood at the edge of the jagged cliff, looking down into the southern pass. Where there had once been a perfectly disciplined column of 3,000 Imperial Purge-Brigade soldiers, there was now only a monolithic tomb of crushed stone, ancient ice, and suffocating snow. The golden banners of the Sun Emperor were buried deep beneath 50 feet of unbreakable winter rock. Silas dropped to his knees beside me, his breath hitching as he stared at the sheer scale of the devastation. He had been a merchant his whole life, accustomed to the subtle violence of coin and trade, not the cataclysmic slaughter of modern tactical warfare. End quote. They and oppose, just gone, end quote, Silas whispered, his voice trembling beneath his thick wool mask. End quote. 3,000 men. The Inquisition and oppose, as elite. Wiped out in a single heartbeat. The capital will tear the continent apart looking for them. End quote. End quote. Let them look, end quote, I replied coldly, my breath pluming in the freezing air. End quote. By the time they dig through this rubble, the political landscape of the North will have fundamentally changed. End quote. I signaled Brock and the scouts. End quote. Repelled down to the impact periphery. The Inquisitors were riding at the center, but their runic lockboxes are designed to survive structural collapse. Find the Sunhound compasses. We cannot leave any tracking tech behind. End quote. It took 20 minutes of grueling digging through the shattered shale, but we found them. 3 golden compasses, their ether glass cracked but their internal mechanisms miraculously intact. I crushed 2 beneath the heavy iron heel of my Aegis armor and pocketed the third for Brock to reverse engineer later. With the southern threat completely neutralized, I turned my attention north. The Vanguard Army was still bleeding out against the beast horde, and my cavalry was riding straight into the meat grinder. We retrieved our hidden frost striders and pushed them to their absolute limits, racing through the blinding blizzard toward the obsidian fortress. We arrived just as the darkest hour of the night set in. The sight below us was apocalyptic. The outer walls of the obsidian fortress had been completely shattered. Thousands of frost beasts, massive, armored direwolves and towering ice trolls were swarming the inner keep. The Solarian loyalists were fighting a desperate, losing battle. I could see their legendary commander, Vanya, holding the broken courtyard. Her golden armor was stained red, her heavy broadsword a blur of desperate parries. They were completely surrounded, heavily outnumbered, and entirely out of hope. But they didn't end oppose. No, the rules of engagement had just changed. A thunderous, mechanical horn echoed across the frozen tundra, cutting through the roars of the beasts. From the western ridge, Ravenwood and oppose, as heavy cavalry crested the hill. Ilara and Valerius led the charge, a terrifying wedge of armored frost striders and pulsing blue ether spears. The psychological impact was instantaneous. The beast horde, hyper-focused on the bleeding infantry in the courtyard, was entirely unprepared for a heavy cavalry charge to their exposed rear. End quote. Break them, end quote, Valerius roared, his knightly voice carrying over the din of battle. The Ravenwood cavalry crashed into the beast horde like a runic tidal wave. Ether spears pierced thick hides and shattered bone. Ilara was a whirlwind of lethal precision, her frost strider trampling smaller beasts while her dual blades severed the tendons of the massive ice trolls. The Horde's backline immediately collapsed in a spray of dark blood and panicked howls. I didn't end Oppos. T joined the cavalry charge. My eyes were scanning the chaos, searching for the anomaly. Beasts of this nature were feral. They didn't end Oppos. T execute coordinated siege tactics without a driving intelligence. Through the swirling snow and runic fire, I spotted it. Standing on a massive pile of rubble near the breach gate was a grotesque, mutated alpha. Its fur was patchy, exposing corrupted, glowing ether crystals embedded directly into its spine. The church hadn't and Oppos. T just abandoned the Vanguard. They had manipulated the Horde to ensure their destruction. I spurred my mount forward, cutting a solitary path through the fray. As I approached the rubble, the Alpha locked its glowing red eyes on me and unleashed a deafening roar. 2 massive ice trolls broke off from the main fight to intercept me. I didn't end Oppos. T slowed down. I drew my heavy cleaver, the kinetic runes in my Aegis armor flaring to life. The first troll swung a massive club of frozen stone. I didn't end Oppos. T dodge. I stepped into the strike, letting the obsidian pauldron take the impact. The runes absorbed the kinetic force, grounding it harmlessly. Using the stored momentum, I drove my cleaver upward, severing the troll's arm at the shoulder before burying a throwing dagger in its eye. The second troll lunged, but I was already past it, launching myself off my mount and directly at the Alpha. The corrupted beast swiped at me with claws the size of long swords. I slid under the arc, drawing the experimental ether revolver Brock had practically begged me to test. I jammed the heavy iron barrel directly beneath the beast and Oppos' jaw and pulled the trigger. The runic cartridge detonated with a blinding flash, blowing the Alpha's crystalline head entirely off its shoulders. The moment the Alpha died, the psychic tether broke. The beast horde, suddenly realizing they were being slaughtered by heavy cavalry, lost their coordinated bloodlust. Panic rippled through their ranks, and within minutes, the massive horde shattered, fleeing back into the dark wasteland. The silence that followed was broken only by the groans of the wounded. The dawn began to break, casting a pale golden light over the blood-soaked ruins of the obsidian fortress. Vanguard Commander Vanya, exhausted and bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts, limped forward. She looked at the decimated beast horde, then at Ravenwood and Oppos, as heavily armed cavalry, and finally at me, standing over the decapitated Alpha in my pitch-black Aegis armor. Lucian stepped forward from our ranks, his aristocratic demeanor perfectly composed. End quote. Commander Vanya, end quote. He spoke smoothly, projecting his voice for the surviving Vanguard soldiers to hear. End quote. We bring you rations, runic steel, and the truth. The Solarian Church diverted your relief supplies to the beasts. A purge brigade was sent to ensure you died here tonight. The Empire has abandoned you. End quote. Vanya's eyes widened in horror, then narrowed into absolute, burning rage. She looked at the corrupted ether crystals on the dead Alpha, the ultimate proof of the Church and Oppos' treachery. End quote. And who, end quote, she rasped, dropping her bloodied sword, end quote, has saved us, end quote. I stepped forward, pulling the heavy mask from my face. End quote. I am Lord Kaelen of Ravenwood. And as of today, the North no longer bows to the Sun Emperor, end quote. I looked out over the thousands of seasoned Vanguard veterans, now abandoned by their gods and saved by my steel. The pieces were finally in place. The ultimate stronghold was built, the deadliest army was forged, and the true war for the continent had just begun.